All right. Hey, girl.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. So, Lisa, the film was amazing. I must say, this is my third time watching it. And I was just as enthused about it as the first time that I watched it. And so, beyond the obvious reasons for the film that was discussed in the film about Christianity being this white man's religion, I want to know what sparked you to take this journey to doing work like this, to being a Christian apologist. Can you tell us a little bit of background about your work that led to Unspoken?
Yeah, so I never intended to be here. My journey was supposed to take me to Wall Street as a stockbroker, but we see I'm not in New York working on Wall Street now. I had electives available to me in my undergrad time as an investment finance major, and I decided to take New Testament thinking that it would be an easy A like Sunday school, but nobody told me that New Testament at a university was different than Sunday school. And so I was shocked when the first day of class my professor said, "I'm going to change everything you thought you knew about Jesus," and that's when I knew that this wasn't Sunday school. And so I really struggled through that time. I call it a crisis of faith. My professor was challenging me with textual criticism and different things and had me thinking about, like, should I trust this Bible? And that led me on a journey in apologetics. My dad saw me struggling. I'm a PK, so he's a pastor. He gave me some resources in apologetics to help me navigate the class. And that was really helpful for me. But as I got more and more immersed in apologetics, I didn't see anybody that looked like me in the space. And so I thought that there needed to be somebody to bridge the gap for African Americans in apologetics. And that's what sparked my journey to start Jude 3. And so ended up switching my major from investment finance to religious studies and communications. And then later would go to seminary and started the Jude 3 project the last year of seminary.
Wow. All the way from money to Christianity, right?
Yeah,
I
money to
mean,
ministry.
that's a big jump, right?
Yeah.
So there was something interesting that you said, and I want to know, why do you believe this is? You said that you didn't see many like you in the field of apologetics. Why do you believe that is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of apologetics, classical apologetics, focuses on the existence of God. And in the African American community, atheism is not something that's prominent. It is on the rise, but it's not something historically in our community that's a pervasive concern. We believe that God exists generally. How he interacts with us, there's diversity of thought around that, but there's generally a belief that God exists. And since a large part of apologetics focuses on proving the existence of God, a lot of it just didn't resonate with the community that already had a strong belief.
Ooh, it didn't resonate with the community. Now, we saw a lot coming from this documentary regarding how the Black community is impacted by other religions and how they are heavily influenced, right? Because what's passed down, the rhetoric that's passed down that doesn't align with what we've now seen in Unspoken, that shows that Christianity is for us. We are in the Bible. But I want to know, and I'm going to go to this question because Dr. Eric Mason, he said something profound along the lines of whites in the Bible have to be found, not people of color. And so it amazes me that we as people of color struggle with finding ourselves in the space of defending the faith when we're right there in the faith, like we are the foundation for the faith, right? As far as in the Bible. Of course, we know Christ is the solid rock we stand on, right? I want to be clear. But I agree with what Eric Mason said. And so what I want to ask you is, how do we keep people from upholding or promoting the idea of Black supremacy through discussions like this, right? And keep Christ as the solid rock that we stand on when it comes to apologetics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what is thought of when people start to say the Black presence in the Bible and highlighting Black presence in the Bible, then white brothers and sisters start to say, well, isn't this the same thing as white supremacy? But when black people are looking for themselves in the Bible, they're looking to affirm their identity. They're not looking to lord over people. And so I think when we think of white supremacy, that is to lord over people, to make people feel less than. When black people are looking for themselves, we're affirming that we are made in the image of God, and that God has created us with gifts, talents, and abilities, and has used us throughout biblical and human history to do great things for him. And so I think I never fear it becoming black supremacy, because the most of the people that I know that are looking for the black presence in the Bible are looking for their dignity to be affirmed. They're not trying to have some power over others. And so I think that's important for us to note. But I think people that have a supremacist mindset and bent towards supremacy might project that onto other people, which reveals more about them than the people they are talking to.
Whew, that's good. That's good. So it brings me to the question, though. We have the history. Okay, we have the information, we have the Bible in itself. Why are we still even having to have conversations about Christianity being the white man's religion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one is iconography.
Can you break that down?
Yes, the images that we see of Jesus and people, Bible characters, deeply impact how people view Christianity. So case in point, there was a student, I used to work with some at-risk youth at a high school in Jacksonville, Florida, called Lee High School, and there was a program called EVAC. And so working with these young people was really just a delight to do. And one of the guys, he got a tennis scholarship to Florida A&M University. And he was wrestling with his faith and asked his teacher, hey, can I talk to Lisa? I have some questions. And he began to think Christianity is a white man's religion. And so I talked to him. I was like, why do you think that? He was like, because of the imagery I see of the Bible characters. He even said to me, if the Bible characters, if Adam and Eve were white, is my skin color a product of the fall?
Wow.
And that shows you how powerful the imagery is, that he thought he was only black because of sin. And he thought that all the Bible characters were white. And it shows you how powerful iconography can be to the human psyche, and how it impacts black and brown people to constantly see the images and people in the Bible and Jesus portrayed as white. And so I think iconography is one. I think also the social times we live in, the social and political times, when you see people using a slave Bible-esque understanding of Christianity to oppress people still, and to not care about the people on the margins, that kind of perpetuates this narrative that Christianity is a white man's religion. So I think those are some things that keep that narrative alive.
Wow, I agree. I mean, it is sometimes as deep as people thinking that their skin color is a result of the fall, especially when oppression makes us feel like it's a punishment to be people of color. So it leads me to one of the reasons why I personally think that we still are at this intersection of Christianity and culture when it comes to white man's religion is we're not talking about it enough in the churches. And so not only do we have the imagery reflecting something that is not, and then the world around us, right? But even in the church setting, a lot of times we're not talking about it, right? We're not addressing how social justice fits with our spirituality. And so I want to ask you, Lisa, how do we start implementing this into the church so that everyone is fully aware that Christianity is not the white man's religion? I don't think that it should start when we're full-grown adults and trying to figure it out in the world. How do we implement that into all churches?
Yeah, I think one thing is to decenter ourselves in how we implement things in church. And what I mean by that, sometimes if it wasn't your struggle, you don't pay as much attention to it. And so you don't think it has credence because that was something you never struggled with. And so if you never struggle with this idea of Christianity being the white man's religion, you might think that's not really a valid reason. You go to an all-black church, you know it's not a white man's religion. Look at all the black people in here. You know, that's a response that I've continuously heard from even black churches. And so I think to decenter yourself, to know that just because it's not your objection doesn't mean that it's not a valid objection for other people. Christianity being a white man's religion was never an objection that I had personally. But I understood that it was an objection that many people were struggling with. So I made their objection a priority. And I think that we need to consider what people are wrestling with in the pews and respond accordingly. And so I think that's one thing. Education, documentaries like Unspoken, but education is preventative. It helps you impact people before they go out into the world and hear the objections that are going to cause them to walk away. So I tell people in your youth ministries, in your teen ministries, start telling them the history of Christianity. We have this thing where if we entertain them, they will stay. But I think if you educate them, they will stay. And so young people, I feel, are more able than sometimes older people to handle complex issues because they're dealing with it every day in school. So they're dealing with geometry, they're dealing with history, they're dealing with all of these robust topics. So their brain is already thinking critically because they're in school. Older people sometimes aren't thinking critically because they've been out of school so long and they're in a job that has regularity to it. And they're not necessarily all the time being stretched. But younger people already have a mind to engage these robust ideas. And so when they get to church, we shouldn't be entertaining them so much that then we send them off to college and wonder why they walk away because we haven't equipped them with the tools to stay.
Ooh, and that's discipleship, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds like discipleship. So we should be equipping our children, but I think discipleship starts at home. Mm-hmm. And so we have to learn our history so that we can teach our children, right? Mm-hmm. And then when they come to church, they may ask questions if the leader is not talking about that, and it sparks more conversation. And speaking of education, since we're here, you have a book that you wrote, Through the Eyes of Color, correct? Mm-hmm. I want you to tell us a little bit about how you journeyed through writing and producing that book and how that can be implemented for children or for young adults or for adults, grown people. Do you have children's versions to implement into churches? Talk to us about that.
Yes, so Through Eyes of Color was a collaborative effort between me and our curriculum writer, Yana Connor, who does a phenomenal job with us. So I want to give her a shout out because she spent a lot of time curating this with me. But Through Eyes of Color really was us hearing from pastors that they were using our podcast in their churches. And so we wanted to help them by having a curriculum, something that they wouldn't have to piecemeal the stuff together. We provided it for them. And all our curriculums Through Eyes of Color, Unspoken, are written on the 6th, 7th grade level. So they're written for the average congregant, but they're also written for teens. Anybody could go through it. We have people telling me they're going through it with their kids because we wrote it so it would be tangible and accessible for everybody in the pews. We knew that a lot of times, a lot of stuff we do, whether it's our conferences or our podcasts, we're talking to scholars a lot. And so sometimes it's hard for the average person to grasp everything. So we make the resources that we produce accessible to everyone. And so that was really us. Through Eyes of Color was us taking the major objections of the Christian faith from a Black perspective and answering those objections in a digestible way for the everyday churchgoer.
Ooh, that's so good. Where can they find Through the Eyes of Color? Just in case somebody is tuning in right now to the question and answer portion, or someone sitting out here right now, where can they find Through the Eyes of Color?
Yeah, they can find it on Amazon. And we also, on Right Now Media, there's a video portion of me doing
Y'all
a
heard
video
that,
series.
Right Now Media. Listen, we have Right Now Media So I'll make sure to add it to our St. Mark channel. But we want to make sure that you access it through Right Now Media, okay? That's what we have it for. I just wanted to make sure I highlighted that. So we have some submitted questions. And one of the questions is, it's really good. They asked, how do you overcome people who depend on bad sources? So we've talked about good sources. How do you overcome people who depend on bad sources like YouTube or, word of mouth, to help them understand the truth about Christianity and its Black roots? Because they tend to dig in on false information. How do we prevent that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things we ask people when we encounter this objection is, where did you get that from? And if they point you to a meme or a website, then I think a great question to ask is, how do you know that is a valid source? Just that question. And then you could get to how they source information in general. So one of the things is, there's this thing, especially in our community, where people feel like hidden knowledge is always right because people are trying to hide things from us. And so you have to overcome that objection, because then you'll say, well, hey, you can show them even the documentary and say, hey, Dr. Vince Montu is a PhD, and they'll say, well, I don't trust white man's education. And so you end up going in these circles in conversation. But I think one of the ways that we overcome that objection is ask the person, move from that argument and ask the person, when did you start thinking that Christianity was a white man's religion? Because it just didn't start with a meme. A meme validated what you were already feeling. And so ask that question to get to the deeper root of the issue, instead of arguing about sources of information, because that could just go in circles.
Yeah, that's really good. I love that. As you were speaking, it made me think of Lecrae, who's one person who, he's a Christian artist. Most people know Lecrae. He was in the documentary. And his latest album, he talks about reconstructing his faith, right? Not deconstructing and totally getting rid of it, but reconstructing the way he saw himself as a Christian. And in one of his songs, he says, I got Vince Bantu on my shelf, I read different, right? And Vince Bantu is another person who is featured in the documentary. And it reminds me of how, although we can get engaged in these conversations about what people feel against Christianity, we have to read for ourselves and study to show ourselves approved, right? And we have to read books that are for us, by us. So I attended Liberty University, just as you did, for my Master of Divinity as well. And one of the things that I noticed was that the books that they were giving us in apologetics and theology, homiletics, were white authors. And so I had to seek for myself Black authors, which is how I came across James Cone, to study to show myself approved. Like, I wanted to know, how do I fit in this narrative of Christianity? And so projects like Jude 3 Project, Unspoken, Vince Bantu are ways to help us grow. So with that, I want to ask you, Lisa, what do you say as believers ourselves, right? What do you say to people around us in our community who may have professed at one point to be a Christian believer, but because of the rhetoric, because of the YouTube and social media and television, they have now started dabbling in divination and horoscopes and crystals and all of these things that may be spiritual but aren't necessarily holy. How do you engage them in conversation and defend the faith that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things we have to ask people is, what are you looking for? Because people add to Christianity because they think Christianity doesn't work the way they thought it should work. And so, case in point, I was talking to a gentleman that is from Nigeria. He came over here just to speak, and he was going back home, and I was saying, well, what is the Christian, climate like in Nigeria? He was like, well, there's a lot of people that converted to Christianity that also supplement Christianity with African spiritualism, because they feel like Christianity is insufficient to what they're going through. Terrorists were still blowing them up, still navigating that, and they felt like they needed some protection from African spiritualism because Christianity wasn't living up to the protection they thought it should offer. And so that's Nigeria, but I think that still happens here, that people became Christians and they felt like Christianity failed them in a sense, that it didn't provide the joy, the peace, the purpose, the things that it should have, and they feel like they need to supplement Christianity with other things. And so I always want to know, what are you looking for? What do you feel like Christianity failed to do for you? And I think that's a question to help us understand the root of the issue and not start arguing with them about sage and crystals. Because that could be an argument, but I think the deeper question underneath the surface is, what are you looking for in faith? What do you think that Christianity didn't deliver on that you hoped it would? And that's the conversation that I think gets to a more robust conversation of engagement. And then you could, in those conversations, you can help reframe what Christianity was supposed to do versus what they expected, had a false expectation of it to do.
Oh, that is so good. Thank you for that. So I really hope that helped someone who may be listening or tuning in online, and they may be struggling with that because in this world today, recently we've had the Beyonce conversation and, all of these topics of, why is it not holy and all of these things. So with that, I'm going to ask you one last question as we get ready to close out the night. And again, thank you so much for being here. Someone submitted a question, and it goes back to our topic of how do we implement the right type of discussions, right? And they asked, they said, states are starting to outlaw teaching about Black presence in history. How can youth leaders and parents affirm Black dignity in their homes or with their children with the government trying to strip that away? So we're talking about implementing it in the homes and implementing it while they're young, but how do we do that when the school is trying to teach them something else or take away what they need to learn?
Yeah, I think this presents a great opportunity for the church to be a educating force for our young people. We give up so much of the education we should be giving our people and expect the secular institutions to do it for us. But I think this is an opportunity for us to host events. We don't do Sunday school anymore. A lot of churches don't do Sunday school, but have teen gatherings where we teach teens history. And sometimes we need to have gatherings where we teach parents the history so they can teach the teens. And so I think this is an opportunity. When the world gets dark, it's a time for our lights to shine and us to educate and empower and equip, and don't leave it to the hands of schools to do it, but the church does it. In Florida, there was a story of a church that actually took on the responsibility of educating the community in our history because they knew that the Governor DeSantis was closing avenues for it to be taught in the church, in the schools. So they said, we're going to teach that program in the church. And so I think it's an opportunity for churches to do things like that, to educate parents and educate students, and still advocate also advocate in society for this to be taught in schools. So it's a both and. We teach and we advocate.